Before Street Fighter II conquered the arcade scene in 1992, the side-scrolling brawler dominated game centers around the world. From Double Dragon to Final Fight, The Simpsons, and way beyond, this was the era for brawling. But of course, one of the most popular examples was none other than Konami's 1989 adaptation of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. With its bold recreation of the TV show's introduction sequence, Konami's take on the Green Machine instantly captivated anyone lucky enough to stumble upon the machine. It was fast, responsive, colorful, and exuded authenticity. And now, decades later, out of nowhere, a spiritual successor and arguably the best game in the series has arrived with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Shredder's Revenge. Yes, this rebirth marks the return of the 1987 Turtles, complete with the original voice cast, visual stylings, and up to 6 players in co-op. Which begs the question, what does this game do that allows it to stack up against the best in the genre? And that's what we're here to discuss. So on this episode of DF Retro EX, we're exploring Shredder's Revenge according to the 3 pillars of great brawling, while also touching on the technical details, including a minor performance issue with one specific version of the game that may in fact have a solution in the works. So, let's get into it. I'm a huge fan of the retro revival we've been seeing over the last few years, and Shredder's Revenge fits neatly within that category. The idea seems obvious on paper: revisit classic concepts in new games for new platforms, but it's not nearly as simple as it may seem. You see, brawlers require a delicate hand in their design. Sure, they're mostly focused on walking left to right, beating up bad guys along the way, but finding that perfect balance between complexity and simplicity is surprisingly difficult. And it's something which Streets of Rage 4 accomplished beautifully 2 years ago, as did other games in their respective genres, such as Sonic Mania and Monster Boy and the Cursed Kingdom. So why is it that some retro revivals work as well as they do, while others seem to fall short? Well, in the case of brawlers, we need to rewind a bit. Side-scrolling brawlers were hugely popular for a short period of time, primarily between 1989 and 1992. While games such as Double Dragon predate this and were of course very popular in their own right, 1989 is the year in which brawling became effectively the default arcade game. This is the year of Final Fight, one of the most influential beat-em-ups ever made. Sega was there with Golden Axe, of course, but this was also the year that Konami finally took a crack at the genre with Crime Fighters. Released earlier in 1989, it's a decent game, but the small sprites, poor collision, and simplistic design didn't exactly impress arcade goers. Later that year, however, they unleashed a new project, the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in arcade form, and it found immediate success. The large sprites, catchy music, fast-paced gameplay, and authentic Turtles vibe were simply irresistible. Konami would produce a wide range of games based on the Turtles property, and most of them were very well made. But here's the thing, as popular as brawlers were at the time, the core gameplay, especially in Konami's games, were generally very simplistic. The original TMNT has one attack button and one jump button. You can press both together for a special attack, and you can do a jump kick, but beyond that, most of your playtime will be spent slamming that attack button. Some additional nuance was added in the follow-up, of course, but it remains relatively unsophisticated. And this is why I feel Streets of Rage worked so well during that era. It had that extra sophistication, a superior grapple system with more throws, more moves, and a tighter overall feel. Being developed for home consoles, this extra depth made a lot of sense, but primarily it meant that skill could take you through to the end of the game, while Konami's arcade brawlers were generally quarter-feeding frenzies that spammed the player with unwinnable situations. It wasn't long after this point, however, that brawlers became increasingly uncommon. Part of this is down to the increasing complexity of console games. With hour counts increasing, brawlers became a tough sell, and they mostly dried up for the home market. The few that did make it out were typically 3D based, and ultimately less satisfying, I feel, than the original arcade games. It wasn't until digital downloads enabled lower price points for new games that we really started to see a resurgence in the 2D brawler genre, with games like Castle Crashers becoming immensely popular. The thing is, many of these new brawlers fell into familiar traps, and while moderately fun with friends, they lacked any real depth. In 2010, however, Ubisoft unleashed a new game based on Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, a promotional tie-in for the new Edgar Wright film based on a graphic novel. Presentation-wise, it's a huge success, bringing 2D pixel art back to the world in style, but the game falls short in some key areas that are not immediately obvious. So in my Streets of Rage retrospective, I discussed the 3 pillars concept. The idea is that a great brawler should satisfy 3 key elements. The second and third pillar mainly focus on presentation. Primarily, a good brawler needs a powerful soundtrack with crunchy sound effects, while the latter focuses more on strong visual design, and of course, Scott Pilgrim nails both of these. The first pillar, however, asks that great brawlers should feature a strong core attack. That is, the basic attacks should feel crunchy while triggering just the right amount of enemy stutter when performed. You use this action hundreds of times over the course of one of these games, so it needs to feel right. Scott Pilgrim does get this right, but it also reveals 2 additional flaws. Basically, it struggles with what I call downtime, or the amount of time an enemy spends on the ground and immobile, as well as enemy health capacity. As a result, you'll often find that enemies take too many hits to defeat, while also spending way too much time on the ground. While there are ground attacks, it never quite feels right, and these 2 issues together hurt the game's pacing. They were so close in many ways, however. So what does this have to do with Shredder's Revenge? Well, key members of that development team went on to form another studio, and that studio has been creating 2D games for years, including the brilliant Panzer Paladin. Shredder's Revenge is their latest game, and given their history both with Scott Pilgrim and before that a TMNT based brawler for the GBA, I was really curious about this new game. After all, retro revivals typically go in one of 2 ways. Sometimes you get a Streets of Rage 4 that expands and improves upon original mechanics while maintaining the heart of the series. Other times though, you get something more like the recent Snow Brothers remake, which is just awkward. The Green Hero's latest outing then, thankfully, falls into the former category. Yes, it's a masterwork in revitalizing a classic series for a new audience on par with the likes of Streets of Rage 4 or Sonic Mania. The development team has delivered the goods, and I want to talk about both from a design perspective and a technology one. So let's kick off with the first pillar of the brawler I outlined earlier, the quality of its basic attacks. As with any beat 'em up, you'll be performing this action throughout the game, and thankfully, TMT delivers high quality results. The impact of each hit conveys power and finesse. The action of hitting each enemy in the game is satisfying from beginning to end. It's a far cry from the somewhat sloppy hit, stutter, and collision of the original Konami arcade games, which, while I still love them, they do feel sloppy by today's standards. It also manages to avoid the issues that plagued the Scott Pilgrim game. Enemy life bars are much smaller, with fodder enemies going down very quickly, while never spending too much time in the downed position. The pacing is dramatically improved as a result. But there's a lot more to this than just the basic attack system, and that becomes clear when you first start a new game of Shredder's Revenge. The first thing you'll see is this, a screen explaining how the game works. Now this is a common feature for Neo Geo games specifically, but it's rather atypical of side-scrolling brawlers from other developers. The reason? Shredder's Revenge offers a surprising amount of depth and nuance in its combat. The mix of timing, directional input, context, and button combinations enable fluid, satisfying combos. When you first enter a room, that feeling of mobility as you leap around the room from enemy to enemy is simply irresistible. It feels amazing to control this game. Combine this with a robust juggling system, and it becomes a game of skill where it's suddenly possible to dominate an entire stage without taking damage, if you're good enough. It's a game that rewards skilled play, unlike most arcade brawlers from the old days, at least in most modes. You see, the thing is, TMNT is a very different game depending on how many players you have by your side. In single player or even two-player mode, it's a surprisingly technical brawler that rewards crowd control, positioning, and timing in equal measures. When you bring in more players, however, especially 5 or 6 players together, things start to change and it becomes a chaotic party game in comparison. It does foster some nice friendly competition with KO counts tallied at the end of each stage, giving you something to aim for, but yeah, it's pretty different. So even if you're partying with your friends, the core mechanics are remarkably solid. But there's even more to keep you coming back here. There's optional objectives to complete, stat boosts, and collectibles within, stuff that sounds a little boring on paper, but it pulls you back into the game to replay the stages and master them. And all of it's tied into this world map system, which is reminiscent of the Scott Pilgrim games. Compared to your typical brawler, there's a lot more things to do in this game that should keep you playing for a long time. But the key here is that it's not just a checklist. The game itself is fun to the point where you just want to play the game. It just gives you an extra objective to aim for. Of course, while the mechanics have evolved significantly, there are an assortment of fun throwbacks to those original arcade games as well. Little things like the fire hydrants which crack open when you hit them, the open manhole covers you can fall into, complete with corresponding speech bubbles. There are parked cars which can abruptly pull out across the stage, potentially dealing damage. There's motorcycle riding foot soldiers, joyriding foot-packed convertibles, and entire stage concepts brought over to the new game. The point is, Shredder's Revenge offers this perfect balance of nostalgia-fueled moments and new, greatly refined mechanics that are tough to beat. So with that established, let's talk about Design Pillar 2, the soundtrack. This one is absolutely crucial for brawlers. A poor soundtrack will spoil the action, while a memorable one can elevate a game to the next level. Classic Konami games are well known for their amazing music, and that's one of the things that keeps people playing, even when they get a little on the quarter crunching side. In this case then, T. Lopes, best known for his work on Sonic Mania, absolutely smashes it with Shredder's Revenge. I cannot overstate how perfectly aligned with the action this soundtrack truly is. And there's a huge range to it as well. The opening stage, for instance, is a great example. It kicks off with an homage to the Channel 6 theme you might recognize from Turtles in Time. Before kicking into a driving melody that feels suitably old school, yet with a modern flair. The mall stage then serves up a catchy dance track that perfectly evokes that early 90s pop music vibe of vintage TMNT. And then a track from much later in the game delivers an almost Streets of Rage-like vibe with its driving beats. And on top of all that, there's multiple vocal tracks through the game that kind of remind me of Double Dragon Neon. The point is, this will likely go down as one of the greatest soundtracks in brawler history, at least in my book. It really is that good, and it elevates an already great game to the next level by driving the action with these most excellent tunes. But while we're on the topic of sound, there is something I want to discuss, specifically the sound lag that I noted on the Xbox version. So when lining up the animations and performing the same exact actions, right down to the same frame, the Xbox version will play a sound slightly behind the other console versions. It seems to be roughly 50 milliseconds of delay or so. The thing is, Xbox does tend to exhibit some slight sound lag under normal circumstances, so it may not even be the game itself, but it really stood out in this case. I suspect most users won't necessarily notice this, but it is something worth pointing out for those that do care about sound latency. The last aspect I want to discuss regarding sound focuses on the voice work. They managed to secure the original voice actors from the 1987 cartoon, and as a result, it feels extra authentic. Though I'll always have a soft spot for that off-brand turtles of the Konami era.
Big Apple, 3 p.m. Big Apple, 3 a.m.
Shell shock. Oh, shell shock.
So in terms of core mechanics and sound design, Shredder's Revenge absolutely nails it, but the picture isn't complete until we talk about the visuals and technical performance, both of which are important here, especially if you're considering the Switch version. So in terms of style, this is where we get to the third pillar I mentioned in the Streets of Rage video. In this case, the style is clearly derived from the 1987 iteration of the Turtles specifically, but within the game itself, the characters are presented with slightly smaller proportions. These sprites have a ridiculous number of animation frames with loads of personality, and each turtle has its own unique animation set as well. Compared to the original Konami games, it has a style all its own of course, but it still retains a certain flair from that era. It feels reasonably authentic, especially when it comes to the backgrounds, which are remarkably rich in detail. The background work resembles later 90s games, however, more in line with Capcom's later arcade stuff. There's plenty of parallax and animation work back there as well. Now, as a modern game, the developer can also push the concept further than was possible on original arcade hardware. That means the screen can be flooded with dozens of sprites at once without any flicker or glitching. This isn't a scanline render, of course, but it's worth mentioning here. But it's also not Unity or any other more typical engine either. You see, TMNT is built using in-house technology created by Tribute that was originally based on XNA, which is now defunct of course. They've since transitioned to Monogame, which is an open source C# framework, and have used this technology to power most of their prior games, including the aforementioned Panzer Paladin. So everything here was hand-built for 2D pixel art games, and it definitely shows. The final output is 1080p on all platforms of course, but it uses nearest neighbor scaling to deliver razor-sharp pixel output up to this resolution without any visible shimmering during the scrolling, so it's a clean scale basically. Okay, so that brings us to our final question then. Are there any platform differences to be aware of? In terms of performance, you can expect excellent results from both Xbox and PlayStation versions of the game. For this video, I had a chance to play it on PS5, Xbox Series X, Series S, and a One X, and it was basically perfect on all of them. Now, Xbox has the aforementioned sound delay, of course, but the PlayStation version has another problem. When using the surround sound output option, the game plays its audio from the center channel only. You can fix this by switching your AVR to stereo mode of course, but that's kind of a hassle. Thankfully, the developer is aware of this problem, and a fix should arrive in an upcoming patch, I'm told. A patch that should hopefully be included in the physical version too. Other than that though, these are the best versions to play, and if you have Game Pass, it's available on that service too. But what about the Switch version? Well, unfortunately, the Switch has two issues with this game. The first one rears its head immediately. Watch the frame time graph closely. Every 9 seconds or so, you'll notice inconsistencies arise which manifest as frame drops. It happens like clockwork, independent of what's actually happening on screen. It creates this constant feeling of stutter as you play the game. After raising this with the developer, however, I was told that the problem has been located and should arrive in the next patch as well, and again, should hopefully be included in the physical release version. Alas, there's another problem. When playing the game with multiple players, the frame rate often falls short of the 60 frames per second target. It's especially bad once you get up to 5 or 6 simultaneous players all setting off special moves. It really tanks the performance, as you can see. Now, it doesn't necessarily ruin the experience, but it is rather jarring and detracts from the fluidity you expect from a pixel art game like this. At least there's no flicker, I suppose. So if you have a choice between the different versions and you see yourself playing the game in multiplayer mode like this, I think it's worth knowing what you're getting into, and you might want to go with one of the other versions of the game. But there's another consideration to make here: the number of local players supported. So Xbox, the PC, and Switch all allow you to use up to 6 controllers paired wirelessly with each console. Unfortunately, PS4 and PS5 only support 4 controllers, meaning 6-player local play is not possible. It can be done in the online mode, of course, but if you want to play with your friends on one screen, you can't do it. Now, I've always thought this was strange given that the PS3 supports 7 pads, but alas, if you're looking for local player action, Xbox or PC is probably your best bet, as you'll get solid performance and up to 6 players locally. But that's pretty much the situation regarding platform differences. Which brings me to my final thoughts. If you couldn't tell, I adored my time with this game. Of course, there's a nostalgia element at play, I won't deny that, but nostalgia alone is not enough for these retro revivals. You can't just duplicate what's old and call it a day. And that's exactly why Shredder's Revenge works as well as it does. The developer went further. This isn't just a retread. It's a thoughtful rebirth that borrows elements which people love from those original games while completely overhauling its core mechanics and presentation quality. This is as close to a dream game as you could get if you're a fan of those original Konami brawlers. It's also a brawler that stands out among the greats. While not quite as in-depth as Streets of Rage 4, it's remarkably close and fairly technical. Yet if you drop a controller in the hands of a lapsed Turtles fan that has no interest in mastery of mechanics, they're still going to have a blast. And that's what makes it special. You can play the game for any number of reasons, and if you have just even a hint of love for old school arcade action, you're going to have a great time. Honestly, it's just an amazing time for old school brawlers. With the likes of Shredder's Revenge joined by Streets of Rage 4, the rock-solid Final Vendetta from Bitmap Bureau, which also released this past week and has guest voices from Audie and I, as well as stuff like Fight and Rage. There's never been a better time for side-scrolling arcade brawling. But of course, we're not done with the Turtles just yet. Somewhere in the future, Audie and I have big plans for tackling the entire series of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles games to better understand the complete history. He already has a massive article up on Hardcore Gaming 101, which is worth checking out. You can find the link below. But the point is, the excitement around TMNT is back, so what are you waiting for? Grab a slice of cheap strip mall pizza and play some Shredder's Revenge tonight.